there, the idea was to try and understand, basically the principles of quality assurance and to a certain extent principles of assessment, and where do they map up in terms of looking at I would say the whole process, which is the quality process or the internal verification process or the internal quality assurance process, and how it works within the organization or any sort of a setup, predominantly an educational setup, but the base of the qualification can also be applied to look at how in general you would maintain quality processes within the organization. So the first unit was merely theoretical, and it had lots of, lots of, I would say, information on in terms of what is a quality assurance, how is it, how do you plan quality assurance, and then how do you maintain the standards, which are, if you are the custodian or if you are essentially one of the flag bearers of the external organization within your organization, which is like an awarding body, or if you maintain standards which are defined by external organizations and you maintain, implement, and I would say manage those processes within the organization, then that is what we were looking at, in terms of coverage. Now, towards the end, it also covered what are called the legal, legislation, and regulatory requirements. So some of them were predominantly, piggybacking on how do we look at making sure that these are implemented within the setup, and what are the, I would say, legislation and regulation parts of it which need to be followed to the core, and how some of them can be then implemented or adapted into quality policies within the organization. And some part of that was also related to, I would say, coverage related to how IQAs help in the development of staff or processes within the organization. So some reflection or inflection was where primarily, I would say, they're primarily for the purposes of, training and development as well. Now, in this unit, as you see on your screen, this unit predominantly focuses on, looking at how do we maintain and run the process within the organization. So this is, I would say, a practical unit wherein some of the evidence that you would need to, put into the, the work or the assignment at the end of the unit would essentially all show practical applications of how you, as a practicing IQA or as a developing IQA, would put some of these things into, function, or I would say put it into practical functions. So as you would see, most of the learning outcomes are be able to. So they are not theoretical. There are 5 in particular, the learning outcomes, and all of them basically are be able to. That means you have to be able to show evidence that this is something that you have an understanding of, and this is how you would carry out the activities or the tasks, or some of the quality related processes, tasks within the organization. Now, this unit, if I look at in general, when we say internally assure the quality of assessment, the unit is quite clear that it is focused on understanding that your role, if you are an IQA or an internal quality assurer, your role in the organization is to ensure that the standards required by any regulatory body, if it's Ofsted for schools, or for example, if it's ISI, Independent Schools Inspectorate for schools, or sixth form colleges, or is it QA, for example, in the case of universities. If I look at awarding bodies and chartered bodies, if you are in that role wherein you maintain the processes within the organization, then your role with regards to this unit would be to ensure and understand that how do I make sure that the assessments which are being carried out by the team of assessors, teachers, tutors are conforming to the requirements set by the awarding organization. That means the guidelines which they have given for assessing the work, whether that work is vocationally assessed, whether that work is assessed through synoptic assessments, whether that work is assessed through exams, case studies, or group activities, discussions, witness statements, whether that work is done at the place of whether you go in and observe that work or assessment at a place of work, all that has to be conforming to the guidelines set by the awarding organizations or the chartered body to which you are internally assuring the assessments within the within the setup. Now, what we're going to do is obviously in this unit, we're going to focus on looking at formats, templates, and the idea is within our organization, we are able to share lots of different examples of quality assurance processes because we work with 6 different awarding organizations. So they would have a very good inflection in terms of we having to be able to see standards, legislation, regulation, and in some cases, how that adaptation of policies has happened on the basis of the guidance which has been given by some of the awarding organizations. So there will be a lot of formats that we are able to. That is, there are lots of formats that you would generally see that they are being. I would share with you, and the idea here would be that when you put that in your evidence, you could differentiate some of the formats by, say, for example, Shazia choosing ATHE or Reena choosing OTHM, Amrita choosing Pearson, or Irene. And she's already done her assignments, but obviously in her case, I'm going to go back to her and say that could you add some practical elements of it by using some of the templates, and they would differentiate and show the actual process of what you carry out on a day in, day out basis when you look at this particular unit. So the unit aim itself, as it says, is to assess the performance of learning and development practitioner with responsibility of internal quality assurance of assessment. So you are going to be responsible for ensuring that the assessments are fit for purpose. The assessments which are carried out for students, depending on various forms of assessments that we can look at, there are 16 different forms, but each of these assessments conforms to the requirement of the awarding organization. Sometimes an example that I would give you here is, and that is the role of the IQA in this particular unit, is that if you design assignment briefs, for example, for a particular unit. Now, if we do a business law unit, and if I design an assignment brief or write an assessment which the students will at the end of the unit take, in those, if I do not include, for example, case laws, or I don't include case studies and just merely put out tasks, then it would not do justification to, for example, letting the learners achieve the highest grade. In some cases, what I will also need to do is for that unit, look at referencing the guidelines which have been given by the awarding organization, whether it's Pearson or ATHE or OTHM, to see what they recommend in terms of the assessment methodology which is required for that particular unit. Now, in some cases, the awarding organizations would essentially give you some sort of, I would say, guideline to say for this particular unit, if the center is deciding to design their own assignments, then this would be the ideal or appropriate method of assessment. Now, you could sit an exam, as we see in universities. Law units typically have some part of the assessment as, say, 60% of it could be an exam, 40% of that could be an assignment or a time-controlled assignment which they have to do online. And these would be the recommended assessment methodology or methods which the awarding organizations would essentially suggest in some sort of either as guidelines or as for example, information for information purposes. And then the center or the institution is at its own discretion looking at on merit basis, choosing the right method for assessment. Now, here your role would be as an IQA to see whether the assessment methodology chosen is fit for purpose. Second would be to look at whether the methodology allows the learners to achieve the grades if it's a graded qualification, pass, merit, and distinction. Are the assessments set in a way which are fair and consistent with the syllabus or the content which has been covered in that particular unit? And are the assessments fit in the sense that they are going to be able to be taken by both learners and learners which have, say, for example, special requirements? In some cases, what you will also need to assure is that the assessments which are being designed and are following the key descriptors which are given by, say, off-call for that particular qualification, or QA in some cases for that qualification. It cannot be that these assessments are underdeveloped or, let's say, not having the rigor in terms of meeting the guidelines or meeting the requirements of the, let's say, the key descriptors set by the regulators at a particular level. So you might design an assignment for law, contract law, as you know, as an example that I'm taking, is studied at level 3, at level 4, level 6 also. And what you would generally see is that the way assessments for the unit are being designed, the IQA will have a major play in that assessment design, because one, you would look at all these factors that I've mentioned, for example, appropriateness, sufficiency, consistency, fairness, looking at the whether the assessments are following the key descriptors, are they in line with what the awarding body guidelines essentially suggest in terms of how the assessment should be designed for that particular unit. All those bits will have to be looked at, and that is where the IQA role gets into in terms of planning the internal assurance of quality of assessment, is that they play an important part in ensuring that they are fit for purpose. Even before they are released to the learners or students, they will pass through the IQA process and through you to see that they are essentially meeting all this criteria, whether it's the regulatory criteria, whether it's the assessment methodology and the guidelines given by the awarding organization. So here the practitioner word, when it is used, can be taken to mean anyone with the role that they take up in the IQA part, which is to ensure that they are involved actively in ensuring, that I would say they are actively engaged or ensuring that this process is followed to the core, and the guidelines which are set are actually followed to the core. So that is the most important part of the unit that we need to keep in mind, is that here we need to be able to do things and show it. And the other bit would be to ensure that when we do plan, we are taking into account regulator, legislation, policies and procedures, and ensuring that the assessment methods or methodology which is chosen for a particular course, content, unit is fit for purpose. Now, we are going to cover this obviously in 5 sessions, 6 sessions essentially. There are going to be the assignment discussion. But today we are going to be focused on completing learning outcome 1, which is basically talking about be able to plan internal quality assurance of assessment. So we're going to focus on planning activities which an IQA would do essentially when they start or when they look at their role in the organization, is that what is my role as an IQA? What do I do essentially, and how do I ensure in terms of falling back on processes, policies, legislation, and guidelines provided to be able to bring them into foray and then essentially allow me to plan my activities in such a way that they are going to help the assessors, institution, students, and ensuring that the everything is meeting the requirements, whether from a learner perspective, whether it's from an institution perspective or from a regulatory perspective, they're all fit for purpose. Now, to get into this role, one most important part is that you need to be aware of standards and procedures related to each awarding organization. Now, in a smaller setup like ours, we have IQAs doing multiple roles. That means they do multiple assuring of assessments across different qualifications and at different levels. But if we do see setups like universities or large FE colleges, there the IQA would essentially be focused on managing a particular subject area or in a particular discipline, and that would be at a particular level. So they would be subject experts, but they will also be experts in terms of policy and implementation of the policy and regulation is with regards to their own subject areas. So when I look at Pearson's, for example, what you would generally see is that there is something called a principal standards verifier, PSV. And the reason I'm giving an example of this without going into the presentation is to give you a bit of a background. So when we look at the role of PSVs, and I've been with Pearson for 9 years now. So my PSV is Lynn Pilling, and what happens is her role is, because when we go out as external examiners or verifiers into different organizations for checking the quality of assurance or basically quality assuring the assessments which have been done by the institution to see if Pearson standards are met, what we tend to do is we basically follow certain guidelines. Now, these guidelines are nothing but standards and procedures which are created within the qualification. And in order for us to ensure that the qualification, the learner's evidence or the assessments which have been produced as evidence by learners are conforming to these standards and procedures is what we need to go in and check. So similarly, an IQA within an organization needs to be aware of standards, procedures, and what are the key bits of, let's say, key areas that you need to be able to check when we talk about quality assurance activities. And these activities could be, activities that are related to, for example, how the assignment brief has been released, how the assignment brief has been approved by the IQA, when was the release of the assignment brief done? Was there a second assignment set if if the learner did not pass the assignment, for example, and it was referred? So do we see the referred assignment being given as an opportunity by issuing a second assignment brief, for example, in some cases, wherein the marks are capped at pass? And are there recording procedures or monitoring procedures in place to ensure that this is a process which is followed throughout the year? So you look at standardization meetings, you look at teaching observations, peer observations, you look at any updates which come in from the awarding body in terms of qualification updates or content updates, and are these being incorporated into the delivery of the qualification is what you would look at when we look at planning of these activities. So planning would be at the start of the academic year. And this part of planning that we look at the start of the academic year would be the IQA plan that you put in place, which is going to be followed by your team of assessors, or which is going to be followed by, in the institution when we look at assessments in general. And they would be the set of activities that we have to discuss in Learning Outcome 1. So if I give you an example of, now, if I look at, just before we get into this, if I look at an example of, say, some of the activities which are planned, if I ask you to put on your thinking hat and then look at how universities do intake. Universities mostly do intakes in February and September. Now, these intakes would mean that students join, they go through an admission process. We'll not go into detail, but the admissions process would ensure that they are fit for purpose, they're eligible, they look at basic criteria, documentation, all that stuff. Now, once they are inducted and they are given admission, there's an induction to the course which happens. And after that, they will get into terms or semesters and obviously start studying. Towards the end of the semester or end of the term, what will happen is that they would be required to essentially then look at taking part in some assessments, which could be exams, or it could be assessments through the vocational route, which could be assignments, case studies, exams, and combination of that, or a combination of other methods. Now, in between that process, what will happen is, how do you first look at how do you define this process? So one first is, I know this because we've been going through this as a process in the organization. But if somebody is new, how do you know that this is how things are going to work? This is when my role starts. This is when my job role finishes, or this is what I'm expected to do at this point in time. This is the part of your planning. So planning starts with ensuring that we look at a program review. That program is reviewed at the end of the year. Before a new academic year starts, the program guidelines are reviewed. These program guidelines, when they are reviewed to look at various aspects. What units are going to be taught, who are going to be the assessors, who are going to be the tutors, what would be the methods of assessment, what kind of assignment briefs would be released, at what stage would the assessments be done? That means checking and marking of assignments be done. At what stage would the delivery of these units happen? That means there would be a time frame or a timetable prepared. And then from a point of view of assessment and IQA activities, what you're going to do is basically look at what would be the time frame in which these assessments would be released, what would be the time frame in which these assessments would then be marked, and at what stage would the internal quality assurer go about assuring that these assessments are fit for purpose. And all those things would be a part of what is called the IQA process. So if I have to say visually give you a glimpse of how these things typically tend to happen, and this happen from, say, admissions to the time which, obviously when we look at assessments happening and IQA process happening, you would essentially see that bits and pieces of this, which we talk about in general, related to, I would say, how we start this process and how do we document so that we understand that this is how things would essentially work would come across in the form of various types of documents. Now, what these could be in terms of documents, if I have to say, for example, give you some idea in terms of documents, these documents would come in the form of standard. When I say, if I have to refer to them, for example, that would be in the form of policies. They would be in the form of program review. They'll be in the form of, say, for example, timetables. They'll be in the form of assessments. They'll be in the form of, I would say, assessment cycles. They'll be in the form of CPD tracks that will be done. They'll be in the form of looking at policies like plagiarism, similarity. They could be also in the form of recruitment. And at some stage towards the end of this cycle, you would also see exam boards, which are going to do ratification of the results which the learners have achieved so that they can be awarded. And accordingly, these results then would inform what the learner's achievement has been with regards to, the studies that they've done in the year. So if I were to show this visually, um, just as an example, visually from a point of view of looking at, giving you a snapshot, I'm just going to show you my full screen, and that full screen essentially would, give you an idea in terms of what all is actually involved when we look at this process through which, we take the IQA or we step into the IQA role and obviously look at this process from a point of view of planning these activities. Now, there are lots of things which are done. And obviously, when we do these things, there is a set of planning that you have to put in place. And this is what would be, seen when I show you my full screen, because there'll be a lot of documents. And the idea here is to share those documents to say that this all is basically IQA planning. So if I give you a glimpse in terms of from an admissions process point of view, if the course requirement has, for example, requirements of assessing initial assessment, then one form of initial assessment could be done on English language as a proficiency. This is one of the documents. You might, as an IQA, see that what type of document is this? Are we changing the document every year? Is the document fit for purpose? Is it useful to help in finally looking at English proficiency for the learners who are going to be sitting into that particular program? There are minutes of the meetings which are documented to share that what these minutes cover, how do you review previous year, how do you look at the next year, and the planning part of it would be one. When we look at program review, in some cases, when I look at program review, for example, the program review would essentially also cover things which are related to, let's put it this way, ensuring that the program is up to date. That means it is something which is primarily up to date from a point of view of delivery. So at some stage, you would look at doing a review of the program, and the program specification will be reviewed. Are there any changes introduced by the awarding body? What units or how the structure of the program has been done from within the point of view of running it in the center. And this is something which will be carried out in the program review. IQA would be involved. At some stage, this program review will lead to development of delivery. How and when the program would be delivered, who are the number of learners on the program, what units are going to be covered, what will be the delivery, who would be the teachers involved in the delivery, assessors, and IQA. There would be bits and pieces which will be related to, some sort of a teaching timetable that you would make. And that would be this particular teaching timetable, which would clearly ensure that, this is available to the students before the start of the term. At some stage, you would also, in the interim, also go back and check whether the delivery is happening online or is it on track, essentially. And that would be a tracking document which you would have, and that would be, say, an interim plan that you would look at for sampling, or, interim plan that you would look at primarily for the purposes of maintaining the IQA process. So this would be one such document. At some stage, you would go into and do, the IQA part, which is basically looking at the work and then approving that work, whether the work is fit, meeting the guidelines, whether the work and the assessments submitted by the learners have been timely assessed. Are the grades okay? You would agree with the grades, and that is the IQA part of it that you would do. Even before the IQA starts, you would primarily draw up an IQA plan, and that could be a visit plan, which could be as simple as that, which lists out the number of learners. If there are certifications which are happening for the year, then this plan would clearly initiate and show that these are the learners which are going to be completing a particular program. When we look at assignment briefs, these assignment briefs will have to be approved before time. So if this was approved on the 30th by the IQA, the release date was 15th. They are approved in terms of checking scenarios, sufficiency, fit for purpose. Are they looking at meeting the guidelines which have been given by the awarding body? So if you look at assignment briefs, why does it only cover learning outcome 1 and 2? Because that is how they've been asked to be designed by the awarding body. That is where the IQA would be involved in IQing the assignment briefs. Some part of this would be related to trainings, CPDs, which could be at the end of the year. And again, a part of one of the planning part that you would do is to ensure that there is enough training and development being given to staff to maintain their currency. This was a part of the induction process. For example, in admissions, after the students have been given admission, are they going through an induction process? Towards the end, when they are awarded certification, the exam board will happen. The exam board will recap everything in terms of teaching delivery. There are lots of bits in terms of following the regulation, minutes of the meeting, standardization, matters arriving, assessments. Were there any assessments which were, failed and resets were issued, confirmation of grades, presentation of marks, then date of publication of results, previous external examination reports, and then obviously if there were any resubmissions assigned, then dates to be decided, and that is documented. Once this is done, you would generally have a notification of results letter being issued to the learner, and that notification of results letter would actually set in stone the grades which the learner is achieving, and they are then uploaded to the portal if certification is being claimed. If they are not and they are moving to the second year, then the notification of results would essentially allow learners to move to the second year. So these are all set of activities that you are going to perform as an IQA when you need to be looking at planning the IQA cycle within your organization. So it involves lots of documents. Some of them tend to be templates at the end of the day. But what you do is you change them, adapt them, contextualize them to ensure they are meeting the requirements of what you're planning within your institution as far as the IQA process is concerned. So one of the key things that we need to look at in today's learning outcome is to understand how to plan internal quality assurance of assessment. So one of the things that I want to quickly refresh with you is what is the assessment or the IQA assurance plan and what is the assessment cycle. So when we look at a plan, the plan starts with identifying what is to be done in terms of whether you are when you are planning these activities. Are you going to plan this activity for a batch of students on a particular course? For example, level 4 diploma in business management. That planning would involve lots of creation of these and contextualization of these documents, which I've shown. Then the planning part is, once the planning part in terms of creation of these documents is done, you would actually put them into practice. Then there are decisions and feedback which are to be provided on the basis of IQ reports or standardization meetings or CPD meetings. And towards the end, you carry out an evaluation whether you have been able to maintain and upkeep the standards which are required. And are you, as an IQA, conforming to and meeting all the guidelines set by the awarding organization in terms of teaching and delivery of that qualification? So this part would be the IQA plan that you have to put in place so that you have your fingers in all the bits of the pie to be able to monitor all aspects of teaching, learning, and assessment, wherein you are able to also then monitor the progress that towards the end of the term or end of the year, academic year, the learners are able to progress in their qualification. Now, one of the questions that you would, if I'm an IQA and I would ask the teaching team would be that, yes, we have done teaching. There were 20 students in this year on this cohort. And out of that, how many students are going to be completing and passing successfully? So the IQA would be responsible here because they have to put things in place to ensure that they are checking on teaching observations, they're checking on the assessments are happening on time, they're ensuring that the assessments set are fit for purpose, they're ensuring that the lectures are engaging. And that is where these meetings, standardization, teaching observations, peer observations come in. And then interim planning and checking on the interim IQA plan comes in to ensure that learners who have joined the course are actually enjoying the course, learning from the course, and are looking at completing the course. So the person who is responsible at the end of the day, in a large part within the organization, to ensure that there is a completion rate which the organization says, the IQAs are going to be responsible, because they are the ones who ensure that if all these activities are happening, then you would see learners passing and learners completing and achieving. And that is where the achievement rate of the organization would be maintained. So it is a very important part of the role. And this particular part, we need to understand what are the activities that you need to carry out. And these activities that you need to carry out are developed into a plan first, which are essentially set in stone. Once the planning part of it is done, it normally remains similar for 3 to 5 years, until unless the qualification and the structure and delivery of the qualification changes entirely. So that part is the bit that you need to understand, that it is not an role which comes towards the end when certifications are happening, or starts and finishes towards the end of the term when the assessments are being done. But it is a continuous ongoing role, and there are lots of activities that you have to look through and follow up and ensure that they are being carried out in order to successfully work as an IQA within the organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? So I hope this bit of introduction gives you a snapshot in terms of what all is involved in the process of IQA, and the planning that you need to do to be able to ensure that the assessments and the teaching and learning, and obviously the achievements, typically happen as planned within or towards the start of the year. Now, the IQA part of it falls back on certain theoretical frameworks like total quality management, the Kilpatrick's 4-level training evaluation model, and the PDCA cycle. Now we can draw some part of the learnings from these models into IQA, because when you look at total quality management, what we are referring to here is that, yes, what we are looking at is achievement rates. What we are looking at is completion rates. So in order to monitor and look at completion rates, which is towards the end of the academic year, how many students started the program, how many finished, how many successfully completed, that is where the role of the IQA comes in, that your responsibility is total management of quality of all the processes which are run, in order to ensure that the completion rates are there, or the completion rates set in the organization are met. The Kilpatrick 4-level training model was introduced by the organization, and that is why it is called the Kilpatrick model, because what they decided, that when they do trainings and boot camps, they look at how the trainings can be effective. So when we look at attending boot camps, they are normally 2 days, 3 days, 5 days boot camps. And here the idea is, when this model was proposed, they looked at 4 reactions which normally come from learners, which could be reaction to the training itself, how much learning the learners are doing, what kind of behavior are they eliciting when they are in the training, and what are the results that the trainer is able to achieve at the end of the training that is given in a boot camp, or in say, for example, organizational trainings which are normally done across 2, 3, 4, 5 days. So this model can also be used within educational institutions, because what we want to be able to do is design trainings and ensure that development of training is done in such a way that it meets these 4 key areas, and it interacts with these 4 key levels of, or I would say 4 areas which essentially learners look at, or employees, staff look at when they get into trainings. The plan, do, check, act cycle is a practical part of it, because you do a lot of planning, but sometimes you have to change the plan, sometimes you have to amend the plan, you have to look at making changes to it. One such example was during COVID. The PDCA cycle was put into practice. All the assessments were adapted to being done online because of social distancing and lockdowns. So these kind of things typically tend to happen if you have For example, a learner having an accident and they not being able to attend a particular term, then you would have to put some plans in place to either alter the assessments or give the learner a bit of a break so that the learner is able to rejoin the program. And those are things that can typically happen within the program, and that is where you need to be aware of some of these theoretical models that you can put into practice or bring into your practice when you're looking at the amendment or changes to the IQA plan. So bits and pieces related to that I've explained, which are just theoretical frameworks that we can look at when we look at planning the internal assurance of quality assessment. Any questions on this so far?
Nothing from my side, sir.
So if you get into the two assessment criteria, my making of these presentations is primarily based on my role as IQA within UK Versity. And most of it is basically from a practical aspect of what we are required to do when we look at the IQA processes within the organization. So the planning and monitoring of these activities and how do we look at they conforming to awarding body guidelines is what has been covered as far as the assessments are concerned. So the first part talks about planning, monitoring activities according to the requirement of your own role. Now, IQA roles can slightly differ within organizations. So if I'm working within a school or a sixth form college or a university or a private college, the roles might differ slightly. And I have explained that how they differ very briefly just to refer it again. Now, when you look at a university, they have fixed intakes throughout the year, say January or August in Scotland or February or September in England and Wales. So normally all the activities are going to be in and around those timeframes that we do. But when we look at a private college like ours, what we have is a rolling intake. So anybody can join the course at any point in time. So some of these activities might be repeated a number of times throughout the year or would need to be repeated and put into repetition cycles throughout the year because of the number of intakes that we do, typically say every month across a number of courses. So these activities can vary, but what we have as a process is a simple set of process and standard operating procedures which have been set for the IQA and for the assessors. And if we have a new intake or if we have let's say, a rolling intake, what we do is we just keep repeating and following those processes every time to the core to ensure that the learners join, they study, they submit assignments, the IQA part of it happens, ratification or results happen, and at the end, they get certification. So if I were to summarize some of these activities that we do as a part and parcel within the college, when we look at planning the quality assurance of quality assurance and assessment cycles, these are the kind of things which are normally done, as far as I would say activities are concerned. Now, when I look at these activities, what I would do is I have divided these activities into 4 parts. So these activities typically tend to be responsibilities, who is the owner of that activity and responsible for it. Then I look at, what could be the monitoring which could be put in place to check whether the activity is happening in accordance to what has been defined in the policy, quality policy. What is the frequency at which these checks would be done? And what are the tools or methodology that we use essentially to check whether these are actually happening or not? So when I look at one of the things which IQA as a role or as a person does in terms of monitoring activities is that you would run standardization meetings for assessment. Now, in these standardization meetings for assessment, what you're looking at doing is you're ensuring that the marking which is done by various assessors in that particular subject course are happening in conformance with the guidelines of the awarding body. That means they're not lenient, they are not borderline, they are fair, they are consistent, and they are, robust in the sense that challenge cannot be done in terms of grading because there is enough justification provided by the assessor to say why this task or why this LO has been achieved. Now, what could be the frequency of these meetings? They could be done quarterly, 3 months, or every term. And then the way you do it or carry out is you carry out standardization meetings and you also do teaching observations or peer observations or reviews. One-on-one reviews, if you do find that there are slippages in terms of standards, then there could be one-on-one discussions between the IQ and the assessor. Then we look at assessment planning. Any course, any particular, course which is starting or is to be taught, there has to be an assessment planning or assessment cycle which has to be developed. That means a plan for assessment has to be developed. That means you would need to know how many units are there, what units are going to be taught by which assessors, who's going to be the marking, doing the marking of the assignments, if there are assignments in our case generally, and then at what stage with the units would start and what would finish, and how long the time the learners get in order to submit the assignment, and then in 2 weeks time or 3 weeks time that you define, depending on the load, how can the assessments be completed, and then you review them to see whether they're happening on time every term. And in some cases, it could be reviewed annually, because when you design the assessment plan, whether it's a rolling intake, whether it's a fixed intake, once or twice a year, doesn't matter, but you are going to conform to that particular plan, and that would be an assessment plan. Similarly, you'll have an internal verification plan. How frequently would you check on the assessments? So this could be monthly. In our case, because of the fact that we have rolling intakes and we have learners undergoing certification every month, unlike universities, it could be January, or it could be June or December, or it could be January and April and September, July and September, because they would normally have 3 terms, and 3 terms would dictate that internal verification activity happens at the end of each term, depending on how many subjects or how many units have been taught. So similarly, if you go into some of the responsibilities that the IQA role will take on in terms of monitoring, would be to look at assessment planning, internal verification plans, standardization. You look at development and training and development, which could be in the form of assessor support if there are new colleagues or new people who join the organization and they are new to the process of assessment. Then obviously you would be looking at supporting the new assessors in terms of understanding the procedures, the guidelines, the regulation, and the awarding body guidelines. There would be feedback collected, and this feedback could be when you see the IQA plan. What most IQA plans that I would show you, typically have what is called feedback from the assessor to the IQA as well. And there is feedback from IQA to assessor, but also there is feedback from assessor to the IQA. And in some of the plans that I will show you, you would also generally see that in some cases, learners have the ability to also give feedback to the assessor or the tutor. So those are important parts which basically help in meeting 360-degree requirement in terms of feedback process. So if I show you one such example of say, for example, an assessment, you would see that there is an assessor and there is a learner, and then there is feedback which is allowed from the from the learner to the assessor as well. And that is assessor feedback to the learner, there is IQA feedback to the assessor, and then the learner feedback to the assessor to say whether the assessments were carried out in fair and consistent manner. Did they feel that the assessments were fit for purpose? Did they feel that they had enough time to do the assessments? And those are the bits that you would generally see, which are normally covered when we talk about feedback and action plan. Now, some part of this also needs to be looked at from a point of view of regulatory compliance. So when I talk about regulatory compliance, what we are ensuring is that when we look at assignment briefs, and if I just give an example of 1 or 2 assignment briefs, what you would generally see in the assignment briefs is that when you design them and when you look at compliance from a point of view of awarding organizations, what you're going to see is that at some stage, do the assignment briefs have what are called assessor guidelines, and these guidelines, are they being conformed to when we look at the process of assessments? So in some cases, you are ensuring that these guidelines are essentially followed. And if I just show you briefly 1 or 2 of them, because we've got lots and lots of different examples. So if I look at the Pearson assignment brief here on my screen, what you're generally going to see is that when I look at compliance and regulatory part, towards the end, when we look at the assessment grid, we ensure that this assessment grid is conforming to guidelines given in the assignment to say that it will only cover 2 learning outcomes. You would also look at compliance in terms of policies like plagiarism and collusion. You look at compliance in terms of referencing, if there is a system of referencing to be followed. And those are going to be bits and pieces that you are going to look at from an IQA perspective. When you look at compliances, you'll also be looking at, compliances from a point of view of when checking the work, are the assessors looking at checking the work accurately? And that would come across if they are following the guidelines set or given to the assessors to look at what material has to be checked in terms of evidence in the learner work. So when we do see these things happening, what you're going to see is that these are part and parcel of what are the monitoring activities or planning activities which the IQA needs to do. And that is what we do on our side. Internal audits are when you have visits or when you have surprise visits which are done, or in some cases, audits which are done to ensure if there are changes in policy. One of the major changes in policies which happened in 2016, 2018 was GDPR implementation and data. So how can data be stored, how the data restriction and access of that can be restricted for various people within the organization. That is where you would generally look at audit reports. When you have external visits, they are external audits. But when we look at internal audits, sometimes you would get to see that these are also carried out by the IQA. And then you also look at risk management. How do you look at mitigating risks which can arise in terms, for example, if in our center we were doing exam-based, tests or paper-based exam tests essentially for functional skills for up to 2 years, 3 years, I think up until 2018. Now, one of the things which the IQA was required to ensure was that the sanctity of the papers, were the papers stored in a secure place? Who had access to it? Were these papers then returned safely back to NCFE? And in some cases, were the papers, obviously in all cases, were the papers only opened on the day of the test? And then the entire material, was it collected back so that there was no risk to such assessments because they were exam-based assessments done on a paper, and was the paper leaked or not, or was the paper shared with different people or not? Those kind of things would be covered in the risk plans that we talk about when we talk about planning of monitoring activities which are required to be done in your role as an IQA. Is that okay? And the subsequent slides, what I've done is I've explained each of these parts in a bit more detail. So when you look at standardization of assessment, internal verification, feedback and plans, data collection and analysis to say, okay, how many samples are you doing? Or are the sample, in some cases, when we look at doing this, we are also looking at using softwares like Pro Monitor, Blackboard in some cases, Moodle in some cases, Mahara in some cases. So you would have technology coming to your rescue to be able to look at data collection and analysis and also doing the IQ activity. Internal audits, and then that would be the part that you have to look at taking into account when we talk about planning and monitoring activities in your role. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
No.
Okay, the second part of the assessment and learning outcome one talks about the assessment criteria is make arrangements for internal monitoring activities. Now, one of the things that you have to do is you have to do monitoring throughout the year. If you look at UK Versity in particular, we carry out lots of monitoring from an IQA perspective, or monitoring activities in general to ensure that the course is on, let's say the things that we are running in the course are progressing as planned. Now, these set of activities that we look at, which will be ensuring that the program is running to, say, the aims and objectives which has been set, and the activities which are being planned to ensure that the program is meeting its requirement would be the set of activities that you look at for internal monitoring. Now, in general, when we think of some of these activities, what are the activities that you think of? So from an IQA perspective, what my main role would be to ensure that assignments are being submitted by learners, they are being regularly checked and marked by the assessors. And then once they are marked as an IQA, I have the ability to be able to draw samples from that assessment. And I need to be able to ratify those grades or assessments which are being done by the team of assessors. And that would inform me that learners are progressing. The second part that I would look at in terms of internal monitoring would be to look at monitoring and checking on the teaching and delivery. Are there sessions being planned? Are there units and learning outcomes being covered? Are the lectures happening, regularly? And on these lectures, is there good amount of attendance? Which are the learners attending, not attending? And which are learners which are making progress, which are learners which are not making progress? Then discussions with teaching team and discussions with the assessment team, and in some cases the administration staff, to ensure that why is it that we have not planned a session for this unit, or why is it that that we've given more time to complete and submit an assignment for a particular unit which has been delivered. Those set of activities would be something that I would be monitoring, because if I don't monitor that on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, what will happen is, in our case, it is monthly. In the case of universities and colleges, it could be termly or quarterly because of the semesters and the timetable that is done, is to ensure that you don't have any surprises in the end of it. That, okay, we started with 20 learners, 10 have dropped out, two are irregular, one is on sick leave or has extenuating circumstances, and we have only so many learners completing. You don't want to be looking at that kind of a surprise towards the end of the year when it comes to certification cycles and obviously exam boards. So you have to ensure that there are enough steps or enough activities which are being done internally from a point of view of monitoring some of these things which are essential for ensuring that learners, when they start, they end up completing the qualification. And those are the set of activities that you would be looking at managing, recording, and obviously reviewing to ensure that they are going to lead to a successful outcome. That means if 20 have started, the ideal situation would be that all the learners have completed by the end of the year. They move from HNC, say, for example, in Pearson Level 4 Higher National Certificate, to, say, HND, Higher National Diploma, in the second year. Sometimes what happens is that you start with 10 learners, but only 4 learners progress to the second year. 3 or 4 or 5 learners, essentially have deferred because they have not made submissions for some assignments or some units. 1 or 2 have failed the assignment, so resubmissions have to be done. And again, the whole process, changes, because you would obviously start one cohort which is successfully completed, say 4 learners, into the second year. The others which are lagging behind in terms of resets and resubmissions would be given 6 to 8 weeks to complete, and they would then start once they complete the resubmissions and achieve that 8 units in the first year. And then in some cases, if people and learners have dropped out because of their circumstances, then the admin and the pastoral support teams would swing into action to ensure that whether they are going to drop out completely, whether you need to withdraw them from the course, or in some cases they would be given time to restart or reinitiate in the next semester. And that would mean that you would have 3 staggered deliveries starting for the second year: 1 which have successfully completed, 2nd which are coming after the resets, and the 3rd which would be given time to start in the next term. So at some stage, as an IQA, what I would need to look at is the ones which have successfully started, say 4 learners, and the 3 which had resets and resubmissions. We need to at some stage bring them at par with the first cohort of 4 learners and make that 7, so that they are completing towards the end in the same time. And these are the set of monitoring activities that you would put in place, planning that you would do or have to do to put in place to ensure that you have a successful achievement or completion of learners towards the end. Now, if I were to detail some of these out, what we are looking at is you're conducting an assessment planning review, which is to ensure that units or modules are being delivered on time, and there are assessments or assignments or work regularly coming in for checks. You're sampling the work to ensure they're fit for purpose. They are, the grading is consistent or it is fair. There are no issues of any, let's say, malpractice or plagiarism or any, let's say, appeals from the learners on grading, that they do not agree with the grade being provided by the assessor. You would look at observations, which could be assessor observations, to ensure that they are, be able to carry out their tasks regularly or their work effectively. And then you'd be looking at collecting feedback from learners. You'll be looking at collecting feedback from assessors, teachers, and looking at that feedback to do some analysis to say if there are any changes or adaptations which have to be done to the delivery of program. Towards the end of the year, they would all go into, if there are a set of activities which are consistently being identified, you'll probably put them into training and development, identify training and development for the staff, along with, if it's a big organization, an L&D manager, learning and development manager. If it's a small organization, sit with the HR or the concerned person to ensure that these activities or trainings are put in place. You would also obviously be looking at your own checks with regards to internal verification processes, with external examiner visits happening to ratify that the IQA processes are in compliance, are meeting the requirements of the awarding organization. And as a result, any changes to policies, procedures are also being audited and adapted to ensure that they are fit for purpose and they are up to date, are the bits that you would be looking at in your internal monitoring activities. So what we do, as an example, in some of these activities is that when we have the annual monitoring visits or annual visits from the awarding organizations, we look at the report, we look at that particular report, and we look at what feedback has been given, what recommendations have been made, or if there were any action points given, and they are then put into some sort of a corrective action plan to ensure that these slippages which have been pointed out, or areas of gaps which have been pointed out, are essentially covered in the next delivery or next delivery cycle. And those would be the set of monitoring activities that you would put in place to ensure that the IQA processes are fit for purpose. Now, how does an external body come in and obviously audit this? They would look at IQA reports, they would look at when the assessments happen, when the IQA happened. So if the assessments were released on, say, 26th of July or say June, within 2 weeks were the assignment marks, and within 1 week was the IQA activity completed, or if it was defined in the IQA plan, was it done at the end of the term, and was it in line with the requirements of the awarding organization. Those would be bits that they will pick up from the IQA reports. Assessment records, they will look at triangulation of dates, they'll look at any minutes of the meeting, and they will look at if there were any action plans identified by the IQA for the assessor, and they would then be shifted into what is called standardization of assessment meetings. So looking at whether the assessors are marking appropriately, there are no borderline assessments, there are no lenient assessments, they are all conforming to the awarding body guidelines, and they are essentially meeting the requirements of having them done on time, and also meeting the requirements from a point of view of awarding body guidelines. And these activities, if you look at summarizing it on the table, this is what it would look like, which we started off with to a certain extent. And some of these are going to be then, activities that you look at making arrangements for, because they're already set processes within the organization. And what you do is you pick them up, you contextualize them for the purpose of the course or the modules, or in some cases, the number of learners in a particular course, and then you put them into practice. That means you put them into work to ensure that it is, essentially helping the learners achieve the qualification and the organization keeping up to the rates in terms of completion and achievement of learners. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? So that, if there are no questions, that brings us to the end of today's session, in terms where we are looking at covering the two main parts in terms of what are the monitoring activities that we need to plan as an IQA. These activities should be conforming to the role that you do within the organization, and what could be the arrangements that you put in place to do these monitoring activities. And you could pick out a few from the table. It is not necessary that in the organization all of these would be done. But when we look at assessment cycles and we look at internal IQA cycles, we look at observation, standardization meetings, these four elements tend to be there in all teaching and educational setups. But other bits in terms of when we look at compliance audits, or for example, annual monitoring visits, they could be in different organizations done at different time intervals. For example, when you look at Ofsted visits for schools typically happens once in 4 years. So the IQA part of it carries throughout the year after year, but the external compliance and audit visits typically happen once in 4 years. When you look at QA for universities, it happens once in 3 years. So there could be different guidelines and different types of monitoring activities, which could be a part and parcel of what you plan as an IQA within your organization. And that is where you could pick out 3 or 4 or the ones which are relevant for your organization from this table, and then elaborate on some of the activities that you do, adding some of them as examples as annexures in your assignment when we come to it towards the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me through the email as well. And this presentation is up on Moodle, so you should be able to refer to it. And what I'm going to do is some of the formats that I've shown you, I will blank them out, and I will also start putting them on Moodle so that they are available at a stage wherein when it comes to discussing assignment, you would have them available and you could contextualize them to use them as evidence or as annexures towards the end when we look at the assignment brief. So thank you so much for attending, and I will see you guys next week to cover Learning Outcome 2.